I love it. Analogical reasoning. Kevin, bring me some water. I love it. And he did. Look at, he's magic. So analogical reasoning, extremely important. And then this is the last, probably I think the most recent form of reasoning we developed. This is, if A is ignorant of P, then A is able to know that they're ignorant of P, or can become aware of this. And to me, this is the capacity to see gaps in how you reason or understand about something, anything in the world, and something doesn't quite figure. Once you can do that, then you can make plans to go about trying to fill in those gaps, to increase the likelihood that you're going to survive and reproduce. So to me, that's a much later one that could not have come without the capacity for consciousness. So, and it is ultimately one of the key elements of being a responsible thinker, really. Right? When you think about critical thinking, there's nothing wrong in the admission of ignorance. There's nothing wrong in admitting when you don't know something. And to me, that's the starting point of education and the starting point of knowledge. Fine. So, comparative analyses, I believe, would have originally been dichotomous rather than spectral. So I think our ancestors would have had an easier time understanding dichotomous relationships than spectral relationships. And these are the types of things that they would have understood in that capacity. So, very sharp contrast, between things like hotness and coldness, hunger and thirst, night and day, male and female, pain and pleasure, predator and prey, alive and dead, us and them. And the reason why, and there would have been rhythmic anomalies as well, and the reason why we would have understood dichotomous relationships, a thing is or is not the case according to those natural laws of logic, you just have to look, if you've ever had a dog, you just have to look, observe your dog's behavior. The dog knows if there's something in its bowl or if there's not something in its bowl. And I can't crawl into the skin of a dog to know exactly what it's thinking. But we would admit to degrees later on. It seems to be a more sophisticated capacity. I don't know if your dog's ever getting a look at its bowl saying, that's looking around 2/3 full. Are you going to be topping that up soon? There's either food in there or there isn't food in that. Those are the types of reasoning dichotomous relationships our ancestors would have had before this, what's in between the degrees. So we were largely nomadic. I don't know how many of you realize this, but the civilizations that we read about in anthropology class, throughout history and whatnot, really didn't come into being until about 10,000 years ago because agriculture wasn't around. Agriculture changed everything. Agrarian societies are one of the main reasons why we're here tonight. Right? Otherwise, we'd be out somewhere foraging, moving around, still trying to find a library to host this meeting. Right? It would be a difficult time to do any of this, to be still pre-agrarian and nomadic. Here's just kind of an interesting look for those of you who want a single glance at human evolution. So the Earth forms around 4.6 billion years ago, and we don't see life, we don't see prokaryotes till about 2.5 billion years before now. So it took a long time, right, before anything came into existence. And then a long time after that, about 542 million years ago, we see the Cambrian explosion. And we start to see all these really neat things. If you ever get the chance, if you're going to British Columbia, look into visiting. You guys know what the Burgess Shale is? It's a really amazing place where an enormous landslide occurred and trapped all of these creatures. And every day they're discovering new species of beings that came from roughly around that period of time. And then we don't see the big lizards till considerably later on, 252 million years ago, and then the big meteor hits about 65 million years ago, big extinction, and then This was an even bigger distinction, believe it or not. Like I'm talking 90% of the world's species wiped out entirely. There have been 5 major extinctions. So lots going on, lots going on, lots going on. Humans starting to speciate from common ancestor to the chimpanzee about 7 million years ago. And our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, coming into being about 200,000 years ago. And then agrarian societies 10,000 years ago. So a lot of time passed before we came on the scene. Here, if you just want the last few thousand years, here are the countries showing what was going on during the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and the Middle Ages, right? What was happening largely in the Americas was there was still Stone Age technology. Some developed the capacity for more advanced technologies, but a lot didn't. And so I think what's going on now with, and I would really like to sit down with First Nations people to talk about this, is that once we have the scientific evidence in front of us, we know pretty clearly that First Nations peoples, that is an accurate term, they got here first. They either walked across what was Siberia and now Alaska and populated the Americas, and maybe from Europe as well across an ice bridge about 15,000, 16,000 years ago at tops. And then the Ice Age retreated, and then nobody could get to the Americas until post-Columbus. But we're related. Our ancestors just stayed in Europe or Africa, Asia, or wherever they happened to be, while their ancestors got here a few, not even 20,000 years before the rest of us. And so when I say things like, we are all African, one of the great things that Darwinian evolutionary theory led to was our understanding of ourselves in terms of our position on this planet. And that we are evolved from apes into hominins that then populated the entire globe. Not an easy thing to convince the rest of the world that this is true. And yet, all scientific evidence points to it. So then why aren't policies and schools adopting what we now know as fact so that it treats everyone on a more equal basis? And I think it's going to be a while, probably generational, before that seeps into the consciousness of the world to realize that, you can have supernatural beliefs, but you can't chuck out the natural stuff as well. So, and I'm going to, for fairness, I'm just going to put this in if there's any young Earth creationists, the world's just 6,006. In case you're wondering, world religions, this is how young they are. So we got 2000 BC here. Then we just had ancient Egypt, and we've got a bit of Brahmanism and some ancient Greek stuff going on, Judaism and whatnot. But largely, it's a fairly young set of names, world religions. They're quite young. And when you see it like this, you realize, in relation to that, it's a hiccup in terms of time, right? It really is. So, and if you've never seen our world population in a single glance, look at what was happening for the majority of human existence and how low our numbers were all the way through these time periods. It wasn't until 1804 that there was 1 billion people on the planet, and even you see a dip in the world's population due to the Black Death. Like, that's how many people it killed, right? But then look at this take off. So in such a short period of time, right? So the world got really small, really fast. So with a world of over 7 billion, there's going to be disagreements. So how do we think? How do we critically think about these important issues? And how do we get along, right? So what is critical thinking? Very briefly, we carefully reflect about information. We develop a skill set. It's important because it influences our behavior. It increases our clarity of thought and empowers us with confidence, focusing our thoughts, and more effective communication. We can have adult conversations now. And we can act as civilized human beings. Believe it or not, fairness is the cornerstone of critical thinking. And in my next book, this is what I try to echo as much as possible, that if people play fairly and use critical thinking skills, everybody gets more of what they want. If you go it alone and violate the rules, then it wastes energy and time and money to point out that you're not playing by the rules. That's why we have lawyers, right? Seriously, because we don't get along as well as we could simply through the use of critical thinking. So the next book that's coming out in May, this is just a mock-up of the cover, 6 Steps to Better Thinking, How to Disagree and Get Along. So we've lost the capacity to teach people how to have collegial discussions, disagree, try to find common ground, and still be neighbors without hating each other. So the focus of this next book is really about fairness and the most basic critical thinking skills. It'll be less than 100 pages. It contains all of the tools I teach at every level, from high school to post-grads at university. And it's basically a nice little compact version of the 6 steps of critical thinking. And there's one chapter devoted to discussing very controversial issues and how both sides can get along if they understand each side and biases and that sort of thing. So that's the next book. It'll be out at the end of May, and there's a series of book tours and that kind of thing. So to think critically about ourselves, there has to be a model of understanding that reflects complex constraints. And we need to find fair and trustworthy means for understanding ourselves and the place in that. So we live in a world of post-facts, alternative facts, and a Trumpian alternate universe. What model, right? I mean, we're in bizarro land right now, right? Our other selves are in Hillary world, right? But we're here. We're stuck in Trump land. We're here. We got to make the best of it, right? So how do we come up with figuring out how information is going to be fair? What model in making important decisions will give us a better, more comprehensive understanding of our world and ourselves? So I call this the Oz Talk, and it'll contribute to better understanding ourselves. It's an acronym for the onion skin theory of knowledge. And you've heard me talk about this, some of you will have heard me talk about this before. It looks at the complexities of life so that we can come to a kind of an agreement and an understanding about fundamental issues. And it looks at the natural and cultural constraints that act on any of us at any given time. And there's really 2 groups of systems, natural and cultural. And I'm just going to whip through these very, very quickly. So the relation of natural systems, if this is you, then you're made up of a series of systems, right? Skeletal, endocrine, nervous, circulatory. You're a conglomerate of systems. You break the systems down into the component parts, right, into cellular and whatnot. You look at the molecular level, you understand DNA, you see the molecules, you see the atoms. You smash the atoms and the protons and you see what they're made of in the Large Hadron Collider. Maybe superstring theory is correct, maybe it's not. You go up into larger systems, ecology, planetary, basically no Pluto anymore, so we've got 8 planets going around our one star. The star is within a galaxy system, and then there are clusters of galaxies, and then there's our entire universe. So this allows students to see themselves in a relationship of how complex the natural universe actually is with them in it. And it gets even, obviously, more bizarre, because if multiverse theory, if M theory is correct, then this isn't the only universe. There's potentially an infinite number of other universes outside of ours, which gets really mind-bogglingly complex. So those are the natural systems. And then we have tons of cultural systems, right? Here you are again. There's your family and ethnicity and education, economics, politics, morality, agriculture, religion, business and industry, law, health, sports, transportation, communication, and the arts and humanities. So lots of natural systems, lots of cultural systems. You put the two of them together, and they make what I call the onion skin theory of knowledge. So lots of systems that we have to function with. Now imagine that all of these systems create this kind of like mental, in your mind, a mental ball of all of these systems interacting. Then what we can talk about is the depth of our knowledge. So let's say this represents nuclear physics. Well, how deep into the onion does your knowledge go? You know, mine goes to about here, and then I'm done. Once you start introducing math, that's it for me, right? So you bring in, I don't know, Lawrence Krauss, you bring in Hawking, some giant, and you know they're way down here. But that's nuclear physics. There's a lot of other bits of information out there connected to that in terms of those systems. So we can also talk about the breadth of knowledge and how nuclear physics affects physiology, it affects gardening, it affects the way in which you comb your hair, and there's so many indefinite ways in which this information is connected. So inside the Oztalk is very, very, very complex. A lot of causal forces interacting in nonlinear ways back and forth. And we can't know all of these, right? We're not omniscient. We don't know all this stuff. But we can look at the clusters. We can look at how these things kind of cluster together. And there's lots of works that have looked at this, right? I don't know if you guys are familiar with Freakonomics. To me, this is one of the best books written in the last 10 years, The Drunkard's Walk. You've got Sway and you've got Connected. They all look at complex systems. And these might represent causal clusters, right? So just think about your being here tonight. There's a few systems through which you had to navigate. You had to do transportation, you either walked here or drove or caught a bus or whatever. The weather system, if it didn't cooperate, you might not have been here. If it was too windy and too snowy or whatnot, it's just not worth it to go out. DiCarlo's not that good, just stay at home, right? There are families. Maybe there is a health issue with one of your family members, so you're not making it tonight. There are a lot of systems that go on with every action that you take. And there's clusters that come together where some of the systems override or are more important than some of the other systems. So lots of organizations deal with complexities. You don't have to read them all now. I can send you that information if you want it. So the more comprehensive the model regarding the constraints of how we function, the better we are with responsible use of ourselves. This is how we use critical thinking. What are the practical implications? Because it's so complex, that makes every one of us system navigators. Like you trying to get here tonight. You had to navigate systems in order to be here. And we do it because we do it in light of perceived value. You think this talk might have been interesting. Well, let's go hear DiCarlo. Let's go hear what he has to say. I value that. So that's what attracts you. And so you navigate through those systems in order to get things that you value in life. You go to university. Why? Well, it's interesting, but it can also help me get a job. Why? Well, then I get more money. What's money? Money allows me to buy stuff so that I'll be happier. So everywhere you look are systems. And they're either natural or they're cultural. But you can't get out of them. You have to navigate through them. So I talked about going deep into the onion and the breadth of how far around the onion you can go. So we use critical thinking to consider our place, what we are within this conglomerate of systems. We've gone from the prehistoric through the Paleolithic to ancient and modern times. We were blindly ignorant. We had no conscious awareness of ourselves or our environment. We developed reflective capacities through consciousness and language. We developed mythologies, folklore, religions, philosophies, and finally, science, a scientific explanation. So we now understand ourselves as a collective within a series of systems. And so this is what I call your systemic self. If you don't want to know what you are, you're a conglomerate. You're kind of like the Borg. If you're a Trekkie, you'll know what that means. And the Borg are kind of cool. So I'm going to look at one example from the outside, just to show you how neat it is to consider yourself within this kind of systemic way. I'm just going to look at your cells and the biota of your body. Okay? So there's a number of publications that have come out recently that looks at you and what you're made of. This is the latest one. You might have heard this guy on Quirks and Quarks if you're a fan of CBC. Very interesting book. I highly recommend it. Here's something to consider when you're talking about the self. Now, we know we're all from Africa. We know we are descended from African apes, but it gets way more complicated when we hold the magnifying glass or the microscope up to ourselves. You've got about 30 trillion cells, the average human, that differentiate certain functions. But you've got 40 million microbiota, and the ratio is about 1.3 to 1. Lots of differentiation going on in terms of where this biota is. But they have very specific jobs. You have more E. coli, any one of you, in your colon now than all the humans that have ever inhabited this earth. So you've got a lot of microorganisms working within specific ecological niches in and through and on your body. I sometimes tell my students, look at your hands and look at a square inch of it. There are greater battles taking place on that square inch than all of the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit films combined. Right? There's a lot going on. Don't want to turn you into germaphobes? Don't be a germaphobe, because you'll just make yourself sicker. Germs were here a billion years before we ever came on the scene. They'll be here long after we're gone. You have to learn how to live with microorganisms. If you become too hygienic, you may do so to your own peril. Hence my attempt to stop the use of triclosan in antibacterial soaps 18 years ago, foreseeing, according to evolutionary theory, that if you introduce an element like that into a microbial ecosystem, you will change it. You will make germs actually stronger by allowing the mutants, the freaks, of which we are all freaks, but you'll allow those freaks to survive and thrive. And now you throw all the triclosan you want at it, they'll eat it. They don't care. Right? Those are the mutants that survive. You're just making a greater environment in which the mutants can live. We got to be ahead of the curve in terms of understanding microorganisms. So what are in logic we call, what are the entailments in critical thinking? What conclusions can we draw from this, right? Well, if we contain more living microbiota than differentiating cells, then what exactly are we? When you say, well, what is the self? We're systemic cells. We're the product of a lot of different systems, no question about it. We are a collective, though. Where's Christopher DiCarlo? How do you point to it? Am I the same person if I take antibiotics and I kill off a lot of healthy biota, as well as the stuff that's doing harm to me? I've taken that part of my identity out. And I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but a lot of physiologists are looking at your stomach as your second brain now. You have over 10,000 species of microbiota in your stomachs. Every time you take antibiotics, you kill some of those. And that can, over time, lead to greater and greater difficulty. Now, you can increase the diversity of biota in your stomachs, and we're starting to see this more and more in what's known as evolutionary medicine. But it's helping us better understand what we are. You are more microbiota than you are living cells. So then, what are you? If you think you know yourself, you're less than half right. Right? If you think about it, those are what the entailments are. So where is you in the Borg continuum in all of this stuff? Right? So it's important to understand ourselves in the systemic way. I think it leads to a more comprehensive understanding of who we are. And I think Darwin would have been fascinated to see the extent to which we've come to understand ourselves as living, breathing ecosystems. Thank you.